Good evening, everyone. I'm going to jump right in. In 2015, one morning in April, when I opened up my laptop to write at 5 a.m., I saw it in the news on Facebook. I awoke my wife, who was sitting right there, who through bleary eyes looked at me in disbelief as I told her, "This is a big one." The next few hours were spent in frantic attempts to contact our loved ones in Kathmandu, the city where I grew up. My main concern were my parents, whose old age made them vulnerable. My wife's worry was primarily her mother, a widow who lived in a tall building. A monster earthquake had rocked Nepal. The initial quake that Saturday of 8 on the Richter scale was followed by 25 aftershocks of 5 or higher that had everyone panicked. Reports were coming in of entire villages laid to waste in the mountains. My parents, with whom communication was difficult at first because of erratic phone connections and lack of electricity, were camped out, we learned, for days in rain on a small field near their home on the outskirts of the city. My mother-in-law found shelter with one of her daughters. The overall human toll was massive, 9,000 dead and 22,000 injured. One tragic news was the destruction of centuries-old temples prized for their exquisite carvings in Kathmandu Valley's old palace squares, all World Heritage Sites. Kathmandu Darbar Square was in ruins. Patan Darbar Square, considered the most beautiful of the three, had been decimated. These were World Heritage Sites, so in a very literal sense, the whole world lost physical access to its cultural history. The temples and monuments of these squares were my pride and joy as I escorted my MFA students from IU on what I had begun to think as my annual pilgrimage to the land that guided my literary material that made me the writer I am. A year before the earthquake, my students had taken photos of erotic carvings in the Jagannarayan Temple in Patan Darbar Square for IU's Kinsey Institute. The temple was now gone. In 2010, we climbed the Dhara Tower, whose original structure dates back to 1832, for a panoramic view of this chaotic yet vibrant city. At the top, I remember, now with horror, telling my students that the monument was vulnerable because Nepal was so earthquake-prone. That Saturday, Dhara was reduced to a stump. Nepalis, most of whom are Hindus and Buddhists, are well attuned to the idea that nothing is permanent. After all, the champion of impermanence, Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, was born here. He also taught that life, by its very nature, is filled with suffering. For many Nepalis living abroad, our attachment to Nepal is fierce. Indiana is my home, but Nepal is my homeland. It's a place I have zealously returned to in all of my novels and short stories, written mostly in that Starbucks across the sample gates on Indiana Avenue. These trips I take with my MFA students every year are highlights of my teaching, and I return to Indiana with renewed insights on how people live and love all over the world. The year before the earthquake, we went up to the Himalayan region of Mustang, where my students bathed as a ritual of spiritual cleansing in the icy cold water of 108 spouts in Muktinath's temple, situated at 12,000 feet. We were surrounded by mountains of unimaginable beauty. Throughout the trip, I was even more moved by the kindness of Nepalis we encountered, from the old grandma who served us food at Hotel Bob Marley in Muktinath, to the guide in the resort town of Pokhara who went out of his way to arrange transport for us. But it was the outpouring of kindness that I encountered here in Bloomington in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake that I continue to treasure nearly 5 years later. When the wounds of that earthquake were still fresh, I received notes of concern and sympathy from countless Hoosiers, strangers even, asking me what they could do to help the earthquake victims halfway around the world, people they didn't know, with whom they didn't have the kind of intimate geographical and emotional ties as I did. When we formed a Bloomington group to collect money for disaster relief, the outpouring of donations was overwhelming. Within 1 week, we gathered more than $30,000 to send back to Nepal. I realized then that I didn't need to go climb mountains in Nepal to experience kindness. It was all around me, right here, at home in Indiana. It also occurred to me then that it's in the midst of intense suffering that people are the strongest. And this is true whether you live in Kathmandu or Kokomo. Feeling helpless, my wife wrote on her Facebook post from Bloomington after many failed attempts at calling family in Kathmandu during those early hours of the earthquake. When we managed to connect, it was our loved ones in Nepal who reassured us, "Don't worry, we're fine, it'll be okay." Thank you.